Да, Мавел, приятно повидаться. Надеюсь, ты скоро приедешь сюда.
Hey Marvel, it's nice to see you. Hope you'll join us soon. Good evening, good evening, good evening, the participants, the audience members. My name is Artem Medvedev. I'm the host of Channel 78, and today I will moderate the Open Lectorium of Culture 2.0. Just a couple of words about the Lectorium. What's the Culture 2.0 Lectorium? It's a discussion project of the Culture Forum of St. Petersburg that runs throughout the year, and it's a part of its education program, and it looks at the culture sector through the prism of new reality. We're using the technologies in contemporary culture, from digital to social practices, and the technologies and organization of common spaces, inclusive and education projects, and so on and so forth. But my friends, let me open up the topic of the discussion, which you're very well aware, comics, art number 9. Let's talk about the comics a little bit in general, because as the pop culture spreads around, as globalization goes around, the new ways of self-expression have appeared, and an independent 9th type of art appears. Why it's the 9th, we will discuss during our session, which is on the suture of literature and painting, with a lot of characters, a lot thick plot, and using the language means it allows you to list comics as a literature. However, the visual component, with its unique graphic style and unusual execution, is part of the visual art. So it's part visual, part literature. It becomes a thing of its own, a product of the new age. And despite the acknowledgement of literary experts, seldomly you hear that graphic novels, it's not an art, because oftentimes it still is associated with the very simple drawn stories for teenagers. How and what expects the industry in the future? We're going to talk about that with our esteemed experts, and allow me to introduce them to you. So today, discussing about this, there's going to be Donatien de Rochambeau, the director of the comic department of the Francothèque Française.
Bonjour.
Hi. Markus Witzel, or Mavel, represents Germany. Hi, Mavel.
Hello.
Dmitry Yakovlev, chief editor of Boom Kniga, an organizer of Boom Fest, a person who knows everything about comics and promotes them. Nicolas Grivel, literary agent, the head of Nicolas Grivel Agency. Hi, Nicolas from France.
Bonsoir à tous.
Good evening, everyone. And Olga Lavrentieva, a decoration of our discussion, artist and comic book writer. So, dear audience members, I'm sure you're familiar with the format. Every speaker has a certain amount of time to make a presentation, to speak a little bit on our subject, about 10 minutes each, and then afterwards we're going to ask them questions, the questions that are going to be sent by the audience members, which will be made in the broadcast, in social networks of the Culture Forum. You write your questions in, and we'll try to ask them. And also there is a poll on the website as to what type of comics do you prefer. Take part, stay involved, and let's begin. That's what I think. So, let's start with Donatien de Rochambeau. The floor is yours.
Bonsoir. En fait, j'ai bien écouté votre présentation sur la
Good
bande
evening,
dessinée
everybody.
et je suis pas d'accord.
I
Désolé de commencer par ça.
listened to your
D'abord, je
forward,
suis très
and I
content de
disagree
voir que-
full-heartedly.
J'arrive pas à être carré.
First of all, I'm very happy
Je suis très content de voir que
I'm very happy
le Forum culturel de Saint-Pétersbourg
that
parle
the
de bande
Culture
dessinée.
Forum in St. Petersburg
C'est très important,
talks about
c'est une
comics
très grande étape.
because it's a very important thing. It's a very serious stage of development of comics. However, what you said, that the comics is something new and that it has a future and that we're asking, who's it for? Why is it? Is it for kids? Is it for people with problems? Because it's a very Russian question. Because in the States, in Europe, Dmitry comes to Europe a lot, Mario lives in Europe, Nicola lives in Europe, everyone is sure that it's a mainstream, normal, proper art, oftentimes dated art, old school art. There is no discussion here. There's no question here. And it's not a question whether somebody needs comics. It's the only question is, what kind of comics do you like? I like movies, but not all movies. Same with the comics books, but I don't like all of them. So this is the true question. The question we're all in, and not who's it for. Also, the fate of comics in Russia is interesting because it's the very beginning, whereas in France, there were 150, 200 years, and we believe in France that the Bayeux tapestry is the forebearer, the harbinger of comics. So it's the more ancient art than film. Russia had magazines like Crocodile, Tramway. They were also harbingers of comics, but then they turned into business, and only then they started to be taken seriously because of stories that Dmitry is going to talk about. But right now it's still fairly complicated, and the perception of comics is fairly negative. They think it's for kids. Well, why not? I'm sure there's great comics for kids. But the true question that interests me is, isn't there a future for comics? Is it what comics are we going to prefer? Same, what kind of movies we're going to like, what kind of cuisine we're going to like. Of course there's future of comics. The question I like to ask, what is the future? What's the future in Russia? What's it going to turn into? Is it going to be a bad copy or good copy of the American comics or the European comics? And this is a truly amazing question. Comics, they don't bring anything new, not for Americans, not for the Japanese, not for the Europeans. However, for Russia, this is a true revolution. It's a true avant-garde, and they're perceived more and more seriously. And I came to Russia for the first time 15 years ago. I was in Moscow. And I said, I want to open Russia through comic books. Because it was evident for me that this great country with great culture, with incredible graphic past, from icons to Malevich, I'm sure there's great comic story in this country. However, I went to the library, and the lady from the library said, we read books here. You buy your comics on the subway. So I had to go on the subway. Same happened all over Moscow. And I'm presuming it's the same all over Russia. So imagine what they think about comics. Now, in the books, in the libraries, they say, sure, we got them. That's a positive change. I see Dmitry smiling. So I think the main here is that the Russian comic book writers find their voice, find their niche. And the Russian tradition of the comic books, I think it originates with the icons. It all started with the icons. And comics, they have something universal and something very cerebral, because the French comic book writer is going to tell you a different story as the US comic book writer, and they're going to be inspired by different ideas. I work in Russia for 15 years now, and I think on what's Russian comics, what's the future? Alas, Olga's going to be the last one to talk, because I think Olga is a perfect example, is a prime example of an artist, of a very fine artist who ventured to look for the identity of the Russian comic book. It's not manga, it's not comic, it's not bande dessinée. It's a Russian cultural thing, and it has to be its identity. The Russian authors have to find it. Yet, it's all very interesting. For Europeans, let me remind you, what was the comic sphere in the 1950s and 60s? When the comic author would say, I'm a comic writer, the next thing they'd be asked, well, what's your real job? Or what's your day job? So we've been through the exact same thing. So I call on everybody, read Russian comic books, discover Russian authors, take part in the comic book festival in Russia, in Moscow. I think it's a great reason to visit Russia and discover this amazing country. I think I've asked a lot of questions already, so let's switch over to the next presenter. Well, after as you started to respond, a million questions arise, but we're going to hold them back. Let's not ask him now. Let's move on. Mabel, would you be so kind to give us a few words?
I can hear myself. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you for the interpreter, and thank you for the very enthusiastic words by Donasian. And I'm doing comics books for all my life. I started as a teenager. I can show you in my lecture, and I'm not a guy who can talk so much, so I will just show you some pictures about my own personal story connected with the comics, okay? So I will share my screen here, and the full screen, and I prepared some little pictures here. So my name is Marvel, and I'm from East Germany. I was born in East Berlin, so I have a similar background, maybe like the Russian people. I was born in '76, and I was doing, as a kid, already comics. And then when the wall fell down, I had the possibility to find these copy machines in West Germany and to produce my first comic magazine. So before I could just draw, and then I could start to publish. I did not know what my real job is going to be, so I thought, or maybe I'm working in the advertisement business or stuff like this. So I went to the art school, and I thought, these guys there, they will teach me a proper job, and I can do the comics in my spare time. But in the art school, I met even more people who are also interested in comics, and I did much more comics than before. This was the time when the internet just started. So I mean, now it's very easy to connect with people with similar interests, but this was the time before the internet was really popular. So you had to meet a person in real life to exchange ideas and talk about comics and share experiences how to do it. And these are the first books I made in the art school. I made even more books, always. On the one hand, I made autobiographic comics, so where I'm my own protagonist. And on the other hand, I always use this little bunny for fictional stories. My books are published by Reproduct. It's a middle-sized Berlin comic publishing house. They produce just comics. The international independent superstars from France and America, and I think many similar books like Dima from Rumkniga is publishing in Russian language. My books are translated to other languages too, also to Russian language. I make comics for newspapers, and here you can see how I work. So I'm starting with storyboards. So Donacian just said, it's something, or like the introduction was, it's something between literature and movie, for example. So I'm personally a big fan of movie. So I start always with a storyboard, like in a movie, and I work a lot. I change details till I'm satisfied with a rhythm, and then I start with a nice drawings. I work on the computer with Photoshop, everything in color, because now it's possible to print cheaper books. And this is my most important book so far, Kinderland. It's also available in Russian language. And this is about my childhood in East Germany, with the wall and with being in the church. So between underground and the official stuff in school, this little guy, he's in church, but he's also taking part in the Young Pioneers. This was a very big success in East Germany or in Germany altogether, and it's with 300 pages. It's a very big book. And on the other hand, the last project I made was this homage of Lucky Luke. I was allowed by the official Lucky Luke publishing house to do an homage. I was the first German to do so, and for me this was a big honor, because as a small East German fanboy, as a kid, I started reading this stuff. Now for me it's a big honor to make one of these books by myself. It was very hard to start with this Lucky Luke, because I first thought I have to draw in the style of Morris. In the end, I just found my own style again and storyboard again, some final drawings. And I also do workshops, because I always like to work with young students to help them making their own comics, because I always remember how I felt as a young teenager. It took me years to meet some other people who also do comics, and it's always feels very great to exchange with people and help them to create their own comic books. I also have a website, and you can check out my stuff there, and that's from my side. So I will leave the...
Thank you ever so much. See, now we have actual comic books in the discussion. Mavel, thank you. Beautiful and interesting. Let's move on. Dmitry Yakovlev, the floor is yours.
Да, здравствуйте еще раз.
Hi, everyone, again.
Интересная история.
I have an interesting story.
Начал интересоваться комиксами.
I got into comics when I was around 20, and I got them into from a literary standpoint. And I used to work at a bookstore, and I read a lot of French books, and I kept bumping into mentions of comics. And then I met guys from the Francophone Canada that introduced me to Francophone comics. I also have a small presentation for you.
И надо сказать, что Донасьен действительно прав в том плане,
Donatien is
что
right.
главный вопрос заключается в том,
The
что
main question here is what comics are being published and what comics are we going to read in the future.
Я занимаюсь комиксом профессионально уже 15 лет.
Because I've been in the comic business for 15 years. Since 2008, I'm publishing books. And for the longest time, until 20, I was sure there's like, it's a superhero territory, and it's like an American culture thing, which wasn't close to at all. But when I discovered French books for myself, French comic books for myself, I was just amazed. Because there's a few books that were published. One of the books we published are historical comics. Emmanuel Guillier, Alan's War. That this year there was an exhibition in Paris in l'Académie. He was the first comic book artist to get this honor. And Alan's War is a story about a young American soldier that goes to Europe to war and ultimately stays there. And it's not a story about war, it's a story about an era. about a story about what happened in Europe after war. The next book is Henry Moisen, The Creek. Like in 1944, the Finnish countrymen have to leave the Karelia territory because the Soviet Union got the territory. And the third book is by Olga Lavrentieva. She's going to talk about that on her own. Then coming-of-age comics, whether it's Persepolis by Marjan Satrapi. It's the story of a very famous story. The Blanket by Craig Thompson, the story of First Love, and the true coming-of-age story. And the next one, Yulia Nikitina, as Midnight Land, a graphic story about growing up in Salihard in the extreme north and becomes an artist. Next one are the literary adaptations, the very famous and comic books, and if the Le Petit Prince and Jekyll and Hyde, and the Russian comic books and Master and Margarita. Here you can see that the literary adaptation, there are two types of it. On the one hand, it can be a retelling, which isn't particularly interesting, or it can be an artistic adaptation when the author brings something new into a known work, like if we talk about Le Petit Prince by Jean Sfar, the story starts playing differently because of the graphic language. And of course, we have to talk about kids' stories, and that's what what the people say. The comic books are for kids. It is partly territory for kids. And the Kinderland that Marvel mentioned is right here, and Ariol by Emmanuel Guibert and Marc Avan, the everyday life stories of the elementary school kids, and the project that we did with the Arca publishing book is the first museum comic book, the Journey Through the Hermitage. The story how teenagers get together in the Hermitage, meet in the Rembrandt's room, and they have a chance to journey through Rembrandt's paintings. There's humorous and absurdist comics. Here, the Tom Gold comics, they're short, one page for The Guardian and for the New Scientist magazine. And Alexei Nikitin comics based on Daniel Harm's literary jokes, and they've been around for over 20 years now. And in the end, I wanted to show you this little illustration by Tom Gold. It's about science and science fiction. However, if instead of science and science fiction you put literature and comics, this is what it's like in Russia. Those who read literature in Russian, they look at the comics, and in the bubble it says, "Come join us," and the little robot says, "Yeah, come on, you really want to." That's what I wanted to say.
Thanks a lot, Dmitry. A great selection of books for people who are not in the know of the comics world, and that's a prompt for them what to buy, where to go. Thanks a lot, and now we're passing the floor to yet another speaker, Nicolas. Nicolas, hello. Well, first and foremost, thanks so very much for inviting me here. I think that comic books and we agree with Donatien, Mavel, and Olga here that we're passionate about comics. Comics is a fruit of passionate love. Every time we touch upon the classics of comics, Mavel talked about Lucky Luke. I grew on the border of Germany in a small village where there were no bookstores. comics. And I remember I was sitting and reading in supermarkets while my mother was running around shopping. I was reading Lucky Luke sitting on the floor. Of course, any comics is a reference to our childhood. It has an element, it has a bit of nostalgia in it. And it's extremely important. Of course, I don't want to dive into Marvel and Donatien like generations, but we grew with comics. We came of age thanks to comics. We have three poles: Japan, manga, Northern America, Sunday, and American Comicses. That's what they call graphical novels, right? Actually, defining a graphical novel today, it's really hard. And European comics, that's the third pole. Especially Franco-Belgium part of Europe was the seat of these art forms. Comics became popular because of specific magazines like Spirou, and of course the biggest audience of such magazines were kids. And everything starts, the whole story starts in the end of the Second World War. And gradually, the magazines I mentioned developed and also came of age because their readership also grew older. Editors-in-chief would learn something new, artists evolved. And initially, the magazines that were originally designed for kids, in the end of the day, invited such authors as Cardi. And when I started working as a literary agent, meaning an interim link between authors and publishing houses, a lot existed back then. Franz Mazarel and the very other famous names were already around. And comics for me is an art, definitely. It's a form of art. I think it bears no discussion. And as Denisian said, comicses reflect reality that we see across the whole globe. Comicses are a song, a celebration of daily events, a celebration of normal and routine. Give me a signal whether you can see my screen or not. I'd like to show you something. I just want to tell you, and I just want to show you how different comics can be. Comics as a medium cover all styles and all storylines. Dmitry was right, and he said that comic books and graphical novels are born due to different reasons. I only talk one foreign language, English, and not so well, but comics is a separate foreign language with its own grammar, with its own syntax, and etc. And you know why comics are so rich? Actually, it was a Chinese art. This is Klaus Barbie. This one is about Oswinger. He's the one who created Batman, you know, an unknown hero. They can be autobiographical works, like what Moville does and what Olga does. It's the same. Dmitry will, well, soon publish that in Russian. There are already translations available in 12 languages. This lady that I'm showing here lived in between South Korea and Japan. She was constantly traveling back and forth, and she was stuck between the two countries during the World War II. So she's also doing comics. But what I am interested in is to show the diversity. How to put it, we were lucky in France. I'm not trying to make my Frenchness shine through the screen or make it explicit, so to speak, but we publish more than 500 comics a year. So if you're a fan of comic books, the language you need to learn to get familiar with new books is not English, it's actually French.
je vous montrais, ce titre-là qui est israélien.
Sometimes you have things like that being published. These are Israeli comics. Ayat Ashir was the author, and the first language for this comics to be translated into will be French, not English. Giacomo Nani was simultaneously released both in Italy in the original language and in France in translation. And it's in these graphical novels that we can trace a very nice development of art. There's some authors that are actually working for magazines. So this form of art is constantly evolving, never stops. Here is another art only about one house in Saint-Denis. Why I like my work? Because I'm offering them, I'm trying to expand my readership to people who don't read them at the moment. What I tell them, what I tell to these guys, find the comics that will be to your liking, that you will like. And I really want to surprise everyone with the styles comics can offer, because comics is a good expression for any type of story. If a journalist, for example, wants to publish something, and they can choose comics as well. Here's, for example, something that was produced specifically for the UN. This is Anton Vide, a French journalist who's been to China and published a story about it. Now let's step back in terms of time. These are the German scriptwriters that we launched this project together with. There's some Brazil comics as well. Everybody knows Marvel, because Marvel is published in 15, 20 languages all around the globe. Olga is being translated at the moment. Dmitry is always on his planes traveling somewhere. So for me, comics is a true magic, because it transcends countries and it transcends peoples. And we think that here's a little novel from Altebold, and you see that it doesn't even have any, pictures that were drawn in details. Actually, these are very simple ones. I like that authors talk about different topics and they talk about different realities. He is an author from China, but the first book that he published was not in China, and his first publisher was Gallimard. And there's another language that's important for comic books and for comic stories. Well, it's the language of the original itself, right? And then French. French is extremely important. Now, a few words about Russia. I know that Dmitry was publishing this comics. It's a Russian version of that comics. Jim the Scuba Diver, that's a publication from independent Strasbourg authors. Here's a French version of that. I only visited Russia once, when I went to the Comics Festival in Moscow. But what I noticed were a whole range of talented authors, and some of them I work with. Or take Alexander Utkin. Nobro was the first publishing house that made him seen and made him, almost famous. Here's a comics released by Gallimard in the French language. This author is super talented, and like Donatien said, what you can feel here is this very specific, authentic Russian style. Here are some of the examples that I can bring from all over the globe, and there are some interesting projects in Central Europe, so it's really important for me to travel around, and this is why I love this job. It's that comics offer an opportunity for human beings to exchange ideas, and let me now tell you about some keys of success, some keys by means of which you can get a very good comics out. So the first thing you need to do is get a good, decent training, and here the training that you can find in Berlin, the Berlin academic training is very good. So if authors are trained in official institutions, in really grand institutions, it's easier for them to find publishing houses, and there are lots of publishers in France, about 50 or more. And also there's an association called Cordelus.
En Allemagne, on les retrouve chez Reproduct ou Avant Verlag. On les retrouve en russe avec Dima. On le retrouve en Espagne chez
And
on les retrouve en Italie.
of course, you can find the publishers in Germany. You can also find publishers in Russia, in Spain. So there's a whole tree of different authors and publishers. And the roots of that tree have steadily grown into all countries of the world. And that's extremely interesting to observe how comics grows and develops and transcends the whole world.
And the librarians, media representatives, bookstore assistants, those that disseminate the word of comics, they grew up with comic books in their hands when they read Tintin or Lucky Luke. And they want to spread the word, not just for kids, but among the adults as well. A couple more words. It's a great signal, like Dima said. When author of Alan's War got to have his exhibition at the Académie, that's a great signal for the rest of the community. I have my own website as well. You're welcome there. I hope I didn't take too much of your time. Thank you, Nicolas. Great portrait in the end. Thank you, Nicolas. Let's move on. Olga, the floor is yours. Yeah, I don't draw too well. See, I'm one of the few people that got into comics thanks to the Boom Fest. I didn't read comic books when I was little. I never had them. I didn't know what it was. And I'm a graphic designer by training. I thought I'll be a regular designer. And then I accidentally got into the Boom Fest. I saw independent comics from different countries, and then I got it. That's my language. It's the language I speak. That's the language I want to learn how to speak, and I want to tell my stories. And it was such a push. It was such a aha moment for me. And that's when I got into studying comics. That's when I learned how to make them. And a few books got published. Suture is one of them. It's a story. It's partly semi-autobiographical. Most of my books are based on something real. And some of them, they, get into, tap into my real-life experience and have to do with something that I really know real well. Whether it's a story of growing up in the 1990s in Russia, a story about kids who, grow up against the background of a social collapse, and they play Chechen terrorists, and they play Russian mafia, and that's how they perceive the world, and that's how they process the world, and that's how they come to certain realizations. So when a tragedy happens next to them, where their young neighbor is killed, they start their investigation, quote unquote, and they try to figure out what happened, and they do it through comic books. They draw different versions of, what could have happened and why that happened. There's like a comics in the comics, a meta comics, all based on the real kids' comics my brother and I did. My brother and I knew nothing about this. They never bought us comic books. As far as I know, there were comics in Russia in the 90s, but, in our reality, it never reached us. However, we still were able to draw. It was our language from very early on. And there was this amazing discovery while collecting the materials for this comic book. So
Я хотела рассказать именно о России 90-х.
that's the story. That's what I wanted to tell you about the Russia of the 1990s. I wanted to put it in drawing. The atmosphere, I was looking for the style for the longest time. I tried to make it colored, black and white, and all sorts of material. And I finally chose this style. This is the comics of the Russia of the 1990s. There's an illustration from the book. And it's very important for me to be an independent author and tell the stories that I need, that my friends need. And I think it's the most important part. And my other book, a far more famous one, Survilo, it's a book that was published in 2019. It's a biography of my grandmother. Survilo is her maiden name. She lived a long and complex life. She was born in 1925. Unfortunately, she passed away this year. And all sorts of hardships happened in her life. Her father was arrested in 1937. He was exiled. They returned to Leningrad. World War II, the siege of Leningrad. Olga, I'm sorry, we don't see your presentation. Well, I do. Well, that's good, but we'd like to see it too. I wish. Make sure you share your screen with us.
Вот сейчас что-то сейчас будет. Вот сейчас все будет.
То же самое.
Да, все сейчас видим.
Так, хорошо. Вы-то меня видите, а я не могу развернуть это на целый экран. Так, вам видно? Все хорошо теперь?
Да.
You see it now?
Вот,
Good.
теперь оно все сработало. Я не знаю, что это было.
I don't know what
Я
happened.
продолжаю говорить. Давайте я покажу шуфров. Вы его не видели? Вот.
Обязательно.
Here's Shuv.
Смотрите, Россию 90-х, мы в нее
There's Russia of the 90s. We're gradually falling back into it. There it is. And here's Survilo. There it is, the story of my grandmother that I told through a comic book. As a grandma, as a mature lady, told my brother and I something about her life. No one put it down, ever. And then I realized one day that I got to make a book out of it and tell the story. And I was collecting the stories. I interviewed my grandma, got details from her. And here we are. The screenplays got remade a few times. And then it took a few years to prepare. And then about a year and a half to draw it. And that's what it looks like now. This is the style I chose. I was thinking, what should a Russian comic book should look like, a Russian comic book about the past. And I tried to make the visuals for this book be reminiscent of the Soviet chronic reels and newsreels and all sorts of, have the contours, the combination of sharp and blurred, make it look retro, for it, God forbid, not to look contemporary. I want it to be like a sort of a manifest of that time. That's the effect I was after. And now I carry on. I'm making my next book. It's going to look like this. That's a page I got. And there's another one.
природы.
It's going to be a lot of nature in there.
События будут
Nice sights.
на карельском перешейке.
Everything's going to happen in Karelia.
Вот, надо сказать, что в своих комиксах я и автор
But in my
сценария, и
books,
художник,
I am the
и
screenwriter
я
and the
делаю
author.
всю работу.
And I
И
do
в
everything
начале
myself.
нашей встречи говорилось
And in the
о том,
beginning
что
of the
комиксы
meeting, I said, you know, the
литературы и
comic is a
живописи.
combination of
Я бы
literature and
добавила,
fine
что
arts. I'd say
комикс
it's
это
also
еще и драматургия.
it's drama.
Автор комикса, он ко всему
So the
прочему,
author
он не только
of the comic book is not just a writer
но и режиссер, и
and an
оператор.
artist.
То есть это
He is also a
несколько
director
профессий,
and a
несколько
cinematographer.
специализаций, которыми
So it's
автор
a few
комиксов, должен владеть
things that
и должен
the author
жонглировать ими.
should know and juggle.
Вот, наверное, я все рассказала о себе, основные свои книги показала. Вот,
That's the most.
комиксы продолжают
I showed you what I got.
сказать.
I don't know what else to say.
Замечательно, особенно
Olga, thank you. So great. We got a bit of an exclusive, I take it, right? All just for you.
будет комикс, или это пока
What would the next book be about, or is it a secret? They're gonna look for treasure. Treasure hunting. All right. The suspense now hanging in the air.
Коллеги, спасибо большое
All right.
за чудесное выступление.
Everybody, thank you for your wonderful presentations. Why don't we have a discussion now? There's a couple of questions that I wanted to ask. Before we start talking about comics in Russia, what I wanted to ask, as I was getting ready for this panel, I studied some forums, and one of the most popular questions there was, what do we do with the problem that Simpsons already done it? Like, repetition. If something, been done before. Donatien, let's start with you.
Je comprends pas l'idée de répétition, c'est-à-dire de refaire plusieurs fois le même sujet.
I don't really get the idea of repetition. Do you mean the same story? You repeat the same story. What's a repetition? Well, see, oftentimes the authors encounter something, that this has already happened. It all looks like something. They will look for new.
Ok, j'ai compris. En fait, en France, mais dans d'autres pays.
I think I got it. Well, see, in France or in other countries in the West, Olga explained it. At one point, journalists, artists, authors, they had to render something to their audiences. There was a message, like a famous French comic book writer, as he was coming up with stories, the first thing he asked, how? How do I tell it? Through a film, through a movie, through a book, through a comic book, a song, or a television program. And repetition in comic books is far fewer than in film. Come on, think about it. How many times did you see the familiar story adapted, like the Three Musketeers? How many times have you seen it? Whereas in the comic books, the artist brings in something new, and it's not just a problem of comic books; it's a problem of any art. Comics is just it's a vessel. It's a mean of telling a story, be it a Romeo and Juliet story. If the author is talented, it's never going to be a repetition. You're going to tell a Romeo and Juliet story in a contemporary way. If you tell Three Musketeers, in the 1930s and the 1950s, put them in 2020, it's going to be something new. It's not going to be repetition. So I'm sure repetition as is doesn't exist. Not in literature, not in film. Wonderful answer to those who asked this question. If anybody has anything else to say, Mavil? Does Olga have something to say? I do.
The sound off now on again, sorry.
Да, 4 сюжета. Продолжайте, Ольга.
Sorry, now we are confused.
Чуть позже.
Mavil, let's let. Olga's going to speak, and then you next. Well, you know how it says there's just 4 stories in literature, and everything that you can't come up with anything incredibly new. We all similar. We all read the same books, and we all watch the same shows. So when we're trying to come up with something new, we're doing something similar to what we saw. So come up with a story that somebody else has come up with. That happens all the time, but you avoid that. That there's a mean that everybody knows. Make something based on reality. Because coming up with something that somebody has already come up with, but telling the real story that people saw. 2 people are going to tell you completely differently. So it's the personal experience that's going to protect us, the personal style in the graphic, your personal experience, your own message, that's the combination. That's unbeatable. And with this approach, you don't have to worry that somebody is going to steal or repeat your story. It's still going to be yours. Yeah, comics on the real life events, you know, it's a life hack. Don't throw this knowledge around too much. Does anybody else have anything to add? Marvel, do you have anything to add?
Yes, sorry for the confusion. I just had my microphone off. One of my friends, he's a writer for movies, and he always tells me about his big projects, and sometimes he's super happy when they are meeting with some producers from the TV, and then he tells, oh, they really like the story, they will buy it, but we have to change the main character. So in the movie business, there's a lot of compromises because there are too many people involved. You have the people who pay the money and the people who make the decisions in the channels. So the good thing as a comic artist, you don't have to do any compromises. Of course, you have to maybe deal with your publishing house, but there are not so many people who want to make your story for the business, to want to make it mainstream style. And I think, of course, when you're doing autobiographic stories, it can be the adventure stories or the love stories like Romeo and Juliet, but you will always tell it in your own time, in your own generations, like for us, the 90s, and for the future generations, it will be a different time because they will meet, the girls or the boys will meet on different parties than we did. Hello?
Thank you. Dmitry, same question. Do you often get some comics and say, hey, Dmitry, publish this? And you're like, I've seen this before so many times, I'm going to publish you. I'll come up with something new.
Well, that's quite a usual occurrence. I get lots of incoming letters from authors, and only 1%, okay, not 1, just 5% of what I get is a real gem, is a real thing, something really authentic, something real good. Because many things that I'm getting in those letters are blunt copies. By copies, I mean visual language copies. Many people refer to the art style of famous people, and this is the first filter. But there's another problem that Russian authors have, and that's a huge problem, because they don't have any interesting stories to tell. Nothing to tell. And we have amazing young artists, but unfortunately, they don't have anything to talk about. There is nothing that they can interest us with. So there comes the question. Yes, Donatien. Yes, please. Yes, yes. Yeah, and we're coming back to the following story, that in France and the US, quite often comics are being created by 2 people. First is the scriptwriter, and second is an illustrator, right? And there are special training programs in universities that are separate for scriptwriters and separate for illustrators. Of course, there's such people as Olga who do both, and there's such people as Dmitry who can do a lot of things But the young people who want to go into comics need to realize that there are two ways, two routes by means of which you can get into the comics business. It's either you're a script writer, you're creating a story, or you're creating the illustrations or the graphical things. And that's what I call on do trainings like that. Writes illustrations, and there are lots of artists, but the stories are missing. Yeah, you need to call on not the young people, but the experts. You need to run courses like that. You need to organize and set up trainings like that, because that's you who are going to serve as role models for the youngsters. Nicola, then a question to you. If you want to have a successful comics, if you want to produce a successful comics, you know that any musical producer knows whether it's something real, something good, or something not. But do you have any indications, or what makes a good comics? Can you tell? That's a very difficult question to answer, but personally, when I follow up or when I oversee comics projects, I think my major objective is doing filtration, is doing selection, but I'm not any different from any other publisher or editor in this business, but I'm not a classical publisher. I just publish things that I like. And I try to find projects that, to my mind, can then be translated, that can then be easily translated into 5 to 6 languages. You know, sci-fi is something that's not selling that well. Autobiography, non-fiction, documentaries, these things are easier to work with. And remember I talked about these lamenting ladies in Korea and Japan. Well, that's the kind of comics that will definitely be of interest, because that's the comics that tells the story of Korea. Korea in the Second World War. That's one layer, that's a surface layer. But then there's another layer, there's another topic that's being discussed, violence against women. And this violence can be of different types, and this is what the comic speaks about. So these are the kind of projects I'm trying to look into and to invest into, something that can be translated into different languages after all, but there are not so many projects that can be a success in so many languages. Another thing that I'd like to tell, if you're translating something into 5 to 15 languages, you can have a guaranteed success from diverse audiences. You can get mixed reactions. You can be very successful in Poland, and there are some comics that are successful in comics, but most of the stories, they can't cross borders. Why? Because in Poland, you have specific Polish humor, for example, or specific Polish connotations. Any humor is hard to translate apart from the simplest forms of it. So what I'm interested in is when you're crossing borders, and of course crossing borders is becoming impossible now, so when crossing borders, comics need to create a resonance. It needs to really create a buzz. So like what I'm recommending to all the authors, use the background, all right? Use the... Marvel was born in Bonn. If he grew in Bonn, he might not have the same kind of stories as if he was born somewhere differently, like in GDR. So you need to have a certain background that you can talk about, something to tell, some story to tell. And then there's something that Dmitry was talking about, aesthetics. But every time when the story is there, you need also to have a drama, and you also need to have something that will be of interest to different publics from different countries. So please take inspiration from literature. Take your own biography, take a good background to talk about, like tundra or churches. I've been to Great Novgorod, and I was traveling there by train when I was in Russia and Russian authors have felt that this is needed, that the background is necessary. Dmitry was showing me the Hermitage and an exhibition there. So that's what is also important and what is also needed. Trust in yourself and play with your own experience, your life experience, especially when you're writing autobiography books or any other books. For that matter. It's an amazing answer and a beautiful answer. I'm pretty sure, everybody agrees with him, so probably nothing to add about that topic from the participants. Let me ask another question, and I'd like to ask it to Olga. Olga, was it hard to produce a comics for you? How much time? I knew that, and I learned that it took you a lot of time, but what other challenges did you have to overcome? Like the publishing houses, how did you contact with them? Give a message to all independent authors out there. A message that I would like to bring to the independent authors is that this is not a challenge. If you want to release a comics, if you want to get to a publishing house, if you have something good, they will welcome you. If your story is good, if your story has enough content in it, you can always refer to a publishing house that is doing something in your line, that is reflective of your own values. I don't think it's a problem. The actual problem lies in creating something. That's where the biggest challenge is. I'm a self-made woman, and I learned myself, and it took me a lot of time to learn how to produce comicses. When I just started, it was hard. Now it's a little bit better, but still, there's so few experts around who you can refer to for help, who you can come to for help. So the biggest challenge is to learn to do it, and then you need to find time for that. Maybe in your free time, in the evenings. And then you need to learn to combine it with your main activity, your main business, or your main job. But if you're successful in overcoming that step, then everything else will follow suit. No need to, I don't know, intrigue or to elbow your way to the top, or no need to trick anyone to get into that business. Pushing houses will fight for you if you have a good story to tell. Thanks a lot. Thank you, Olga. I would also like to learn that. Dmitry, is there a way to learn comics? Is there a way to train doing this? Because I'm trying to go back. I'm trying to go away from Russia, but you're bringing me back here. You see what Nicola was saying, and what Madel was saying, and what Donatien was saying. All of them grew with comicses. They know how to read them, and they know that comicses can be different. In Russia, we never had a situation like that. Neither me nor Olga were reading comicses back in our childhood, but the modern generation likes doing that, because in the last 7 years, the graphic novels market in Russia, the comics market in Russia, is part of the bigger books market, has finally gained a specific shape, and you can find everything to your liking, basically. You can go to any bookstore and you can see what's there, and you can copy, or you can gain experience from established prolific authors. That's one thing. But second, you need to develop your own artistic style, your own artistic taste. But that you need to do by yourself. You can train as a graphic artist, as a graphic designer, and you need to develop patience, basically, because drawing a comics book takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of time, so you need to sit back, you need to find time for that. So it's a hard job. But recently, there's been so many comic trainings or classes popping up like mushrooms after rain, and it's not only being done by Russian authors, but foreign ones. Everything's now online, so at your fingertips. Almost. The High School of Economics in Moscow have a huge, even a big department, and I think they're running courses like that for the second or third year. Wow, that's cool. And everything is pretty accessible, right? So we're not lagging behind in Russia. Take our country. Many people like that, but others don't. If you're not in the know of comics, if you're not in this kind of industry, industry, in this kind of business, you need to know where to go to find comic books. Now the situation has changed because for a very long period of time, comic books were sold in specialized stores. And a person from the street will never go to a comic book store because who am I to go there? Am I a kid or something? But now, in every bookstore in Russia, you'll be able to find a whole rack or a shelf or even a full department just with Komikses. You have it in the House of Books in St. Pete's, in Moscow, in Tverskaya Street. It's ubiquitous. Yeah, and I'm happy to hear that. Dana Sien, what I would like to ask you now about, in the beginning of your speech, you said that you're interested about the future of comics in Russia. I don't know, is it going to be a good copy or is it going to be something authentic and interesting? Do you think that a Russian comics can be different from a European one? Do you think it's going to produce something new, or will it only take things from the old days? A short remark about that. A short comment about that. Comic books in Russia are growing and they're developing this way. You know, there are online comics is available. And in the youth library in Moscow website, there is even a map from Google Maps showing you the locations of comic book stores. Such stores exist beyond the Ural Mountains even, so there are stores where you can buy comic books today in Russia. Were you asking about the future of comic stories and comic books in Russia? Yeah, I just want you to elaborate on that topic, and I want you to give us more ideas about that. Actually, Olga's a symbol of the future, and others, and other authors like that. So Nikolai was really right mentioning the true Russian identity. That's extremely important. And luckily, Dmitry and other publishing houses like him, they publish Russian authors abroad. And it's really interesting to read a book about the life of Russia. There's a comics that's soon going to be released by Renny Diktov, a journalist who is really well known in Russia. He's like he's writing comic books about Romanov families, and he's the one bringing Romanovs back to Europe. And I think Russia should be doing something along those lines. And I'm often being contacted by authors from Russia, and everybody talks to me saying, I'm more of a European kind of artist. Will I be able to publish in Europe? You know what kind of problem we have in Europe? We have so many European authors. We have so many comic book authors. We're publishing 500 comic books a year in France. We can't digest all that. It's too much. And if a Russian artist wants to be published in New York, in Tokyo, and in Paris, don't spend time on learning how to be a European. Try to be more Russian. It's like French trying to learn to produce vodka. It's going to be a very bad copy. Don't even try to try it. But Boom Kniga Festival or Boom Kniga Press, it's an amazing thing. So I'm not going to bring to you the new Superman or the new Tintin, because these are American characters. We need to be doing something that Olga, for example, does.
Oh, I understand. Oh, Nikolai, I see you got something to say.
C'est difficile de donner son opinion sur l'avenir de la BD en Russie.
Well, it's hard to evaluate the future of the comics in Russia because I've only been there once. I talk to Dima almost every week, and we're talking about the future of the Russian market. And I see the future through Dmitri's eyes. And the situation with Askol and Olga helps everyone.
Je vais souvent en Amérique centrale. Et en Amérique centrale, on a organisé une compétition.
It's hard for me to give examples from Russia. I don't know enough. But let me tell you an example from Central America. From Panama to Honduras to Guatemala, there's a competition for young artists, and it turned out that the locals don't particularly get the comic culture. So the competition for young rising talent appeared, and it helped find new talent. And the publishers, like Dmitry, those who usually, publish 60 to 70% of, translated works, same publishers get into local authors where there's this local background, like in Central America, in this example. The magazines publish some preliminary chapters, but it takes time for this pendulum to start swinging. The books, the schools appear, publishing houses appear, libraries appear, the special stores appear. And I think the teaching activity appears on different levels. And I think we can lay the stone in the future walls of the comic book house. Dmitry, what do you think is coming in the future? Maybe a small comment from me. See, I don't fully understand what is a successful comic book. Is it a comic book that turns into a movie? Or what is that? Well, see, if a comic book is turned into a film, I'm sure it's successful from financial standpoint, because movies are, it's a totally different budget. But for me, as a publisher, a successful comic book, the most successful Russian comic book is Survila, Olga's book. We published it a year and a half ago. And this year we sold out the entire print. It's small, it's 2,000 books, but we've sold the entire print. We sold the rights. It's been released in French and in Swedish, and English and German, Polish, and Norwegian are next. And it's the first Russian comic book ever, I think, that upon release for the rights to be sold to different countries. When it comes to the future, I think 3 to 4 years, there is new authors coming to Russia, and I'm ecstatic about it. So we're on a threshold, right? Well, in the past 10 years, there were lots of thresholds. Well, not that they weren't there, not that we don't have comic books. I'm saying like just on a global scale. Probably, I think so. One of the key things is that Russian comic books are now translated into other languages. They're read in other languages. Awesome. Mabel, you as an artist, can you fantasize who today can be a protagonist for a comic book, whether Russian or international, but today, in this point in time?
Protagonist. Okay. It can be just an ordinary teenager, because I think that teenagers today, they're much more similar all over the world, because all of the teenagers, they are using this little machines here, and I think this little magic little machines, they are real danger to the future of comic books, or generally to the future of books, because I see it on myself. Since I'm having this, and I started really late, I'm reading less and less books. And this year I started again on purpose to on at least one evening a week, I put this thing aside and I read some books again, which I did not for the last 3, 4, 5 years. And I think so a perfect protagonist for today's comic book market would be a teenager who's grown up with this smartphones and can't imagine a life without a smartphone. So this would be maybe a perfect story. Some teenager who have to lose his smartphone and he has to survive without. And I think this is a story which can be understandable all over the world. Just a spontaneous idea.
По-моему, хорошая мысль, кстати. Возьмите на заметку.
Lovely idea.
К вам такой же вопрос. Кто сейчас...
Olga, same question to you. Who can be a protagonist of a comic book today? Or is it only autobiographical for you?
По реальным событиям, я имел в виду.
Ну, я так не
Well,
мыслю взять
see, I don't think in such terms, like I'm gonna sit down and construct a protagonist. You know, a protagonist is part of a story, it's part of an ambience, it's part of everything, so, you know, it all comes together, it writes itself.
Мне на самом деле
So it's hard for me to answer a question like this, like what's a successful Russian comic book or a successful protagonist. For me, questions like this, they just honestly make me stumble. I just sit and draw all day long, and I don't really know what's happening outside. So honestly, I'm in my own world most of the time. And this construction of protagonist is not my strategy. No. So we're getting questions. I have to look into them. Our question: is the American comic book audience different from the European comic book audience and potentially Russian? But like, if you know between American and European, the audience, the target audience of comic books. Anybody answer?
Que ce soit pour les questions des héros, de savoir si on peut faire des répétitions, de savoir tous ces trucs-là. Très souvent, une bonne grille.
See, I want to comment on the question about the protagonist and the repetition. Of course, different audiences are out there. There are comic books, but they're not just, you know, in the United States, they also have Mickey Mouse. And in Europe, almost everybody reads comic books. In the United States, it's mainly teenagers. In Japan, there is an age restriction, you know, 8 to 12, 12, 14, 14 to 16. These are just very different styles, different features, depending on the age group of the target audience. And yes, like in film, fans of American film are different from those who love European cinema. Yeah, they're different. They differ by country. The readers are going to be different. There's nothing unusual about it. Same with film or books. And if you don't mind, I'll put my 2 euro cents in. I agree with you, Donatien, but there's a feminization of the comic book audience. Like in the United States, what I'm seeing, which is very interesting. Even a person who isn't crazy about a comic book can easily have Chris Ware on their shelf. If somebody likes journalism, there's going to be just a call on Palestine. For somebody who is into LGBTQ, will read Детские. And like in Pantheon, Pantheon is in the US. There are books in libraries. And I'm talking about like middle-class Americans in large cities. They are going to have some comic book representation at their shelves. It's pretty mainstream in the US. Mencha, who did The Walking Dead, has a very super broad target audience. Comic books evolve, and it evolves because it's a graphic novel now. But that whole definition of the graphic novel, for me, by now, is lost because those people are maybe going to read their first comic book just because they like the topic, just because they're interested in, you know, what's a kid that grows up in DDR, or what's the story of a kid growing up in Russia in the 1990s. Cultural associations start popping up. People who read, they change, they alter, but such distribution as in Japan, I don't think it happens here. Well, see, for the longest time, I'm talking about Russia, for the longest time, the comic books are a marginal fan thing. But in the past 10 years, there's been a turnaround. And as I showed you in the presentation, comic books can cover all sorts of topics. They can tell you, it can be told through all sorts of visual languages. And indeed, the audience is quite ample. And our books oftentimes are read by people who just read books. And literature and comic books on the same shelf is so normal. And what Nicolas was saying, the feminization among the audience, indeed this is happening. But it's not just about comic books, I think it's about reading in general. Women read more. And of course, they read more of comic books. Nicolas, could you explain, you brushed upon this subject, the comic book and the graphic novel. The difference is just the number of pages, or what? Would you care to explain to an ignorant person like myself?
Alors, c'est une question piège. Je vais essayer. Je ne suis pas historien.
There's a catch. I see a catch in this question. You see, I'm not a comic books historian, so I'll probably explain it this way. I think Franz Mazzarell was the one who started graphic novels. He was the predecessor. Then Karl Spiegelman took it over. Yeah, and if you count the number of pages in this guy's works, you will definitely find more pages. You know, with Tintin, you have from 48 to 66 pages. In the Mouse novel, you might have a couple of hundreds of pages. That's how long the story goes. Front format, that's another thing, which is really similar to the novel, although it's graphical. The publisher of Mouse was Pantheon. Pantheon was a very serious publishing house, and it's a publishing house that does not specialize in comic books at all. Oh yes, I'm sorry, I forgot. William Lesner, I have some chronology issues here, so the timeline is broken, but never mind that. And then, you usually come to associate authors with the publishing houses, right? And when the publishing house meets a good author, they actually, they bear kids, they bear children, and these children are usually twins. So you get not just comics, but graphical novels. And Dmitry has that, and Dmitry publishes that. That's one thing. But the other thing is, take a graphic novel, for example, The Walking Dead. They're also labeled as a graphic novel, but I think it's different in terms of its genre. Thanks a lot, Dmitry, please. Yeah, let me tell how are things in Russia. Quite often, people in the professional media, like librarians or bookstores, have a very strange association in their mind when the word comics is being uttered. They often are shy about comics, or they don't really like it being pronounced. They believe it's a low genre. But when instead of comics you use another word or another expression, graphic novel, their attitude towards it changes and it opens up the door. So it's a marketing thing. It is a pure marketing thing for sure. And yeah, it was created in the US. Bill Eisner previously was drawing adventure stories, adventure magazines, but then at one point in time he published an autobiographic book about Jewish quarters in New York. You can't really call it a comic books, right? So that's how he coined the term graphic novels. Yeah, Donatien, please.
Oui, un seul mot pour parler du roman graphique.
Again, a short comment regarding the graphic novel discussion. The things that you're showing right now is, yeah, you're being snobbish. Yeah, the things that you're talking about are about marketing, and also you're talking about snobs, because snobs, they just want to make it look like it's better than just reading comics. Now, yeah, you explained it to me in clear language, in clear words. Thanks a lot, Donatien, for explaining me that. Olga, you don't see any difference between comic books or graphic novels? Those of you who are getting confused, let me explain it even shorter. Comics is a form, and a graphic novel is a genre inside a form. So any graphic novel, by definition, is a comics. But not every comics is a graphic novel. That's it. It sounds pretty easy. Exactly. That's so simple now. Friends, since we got together in a company like that, I can't but ask you to do the following, please. All of you are gurus of comic books, book industry, and all of you know a lot. I know it's going to be hard to do that right now, but can you please list top 3 comic books that everybody must read, everybody need to get familiar with to dive deep into the industry? You can take them from different directions. I understand that everyone will have his own top 3. You can take one European, you can take one manga, I don't know, one American. Just anything to your liking. Fire out. Donatien, we'll start with you.
C'est bien parce que je vais pouvoir dire des trucs que les autres pourront pas dire.
I would say something that probably no one else will say. I will recommend you Franco-Belgium comics because they're not being known in the world. Tintin, #1 for sure. Asterix and Obelix, #2, all translated into Russian. And maybe Marjan de Saint-Tropez. Or Carton Martes, that's the 4th one. Please be slower, because I don't have time to put it down. Once again, Asterix, Tintin, that's 2nd, and Carton Martes, that's 3rd. Perfect, great. Nicolas, your turn.
Évident. Je vais commencer par les États-Unis. Je vais dire.
I'll start with the U.S. Alison Bechdel.
Pour les États-Unis.
That's my main choice for the US. Europe. I will probably name here either the War of Trenches or Here, authored by Tardy Ferres. And maybe you're thinking that I'm advertising myself right now. But Kumsuk, it's another one that I'm recommending you read. It's an amazing book about memory. A weed. Yeah, I'm a title owner for the book, but that's an amazing book. Thanks a lot. Marvel?
Yes, I choose one guy from France, Christophe Blain. I hope I speak the name right. Isaac the Pirate. It's an unfinished story, but I really like it. And from America, I choose Chester Brown. I Never Liked You. He made a lot of books. I hate the other books, but I love this book. I love coming-of-age stories, and this is the most coming-of-age story ever. And I just choose a very old German guy, E.O. Plauen. He made the stories Father and Son. It's without words, so it's a classic. It's a black and white classic from the good old times. I wrote it down in the chat.
Спасибо, Дмитрий.
Thank you, Dmitry. Everything's very simple with me. Olga Lavrentieva Survila, Mavel Kinderland. And let's take Ascult Akishin and Mikhail Zaslavsky, Master and Margarita. Everybody nodded to that, and everybody agreed to this beautiful choice. Olga, now it's your turn. Well, 3 is a torture. Let's take one from Russia, say Yulia Nikitina, The Midnight Land. 1 European. Edmond Baudouin, he's a god of comics for me. And as far as American, Craig Thompson. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you very much, amazing friends. Thanks a lot, dear viewers. Thanks for watching us. And I would like to wrap it all up by telling you the following. That's an amazing discussion. Actually, I didn't want to end the discussion, but I still want to finish by quoting the greats. If loving comics is not something right, I don't want to be right. A quote by Michelangelo from Ninja Turtles. Thanks a lot for the discussion. And the next lecture is going to be tomorrow. Our open lectorium will continue at 6 p.m. and we're going to talk about museums and culture. Thanks a lot for coming in. Thanks a lot to our experts. Do read comic books. And please be healthy, stay safe. Bye-bye.
Right.